So yes, this may be right now the cheapest, most efficient, freest payment network on the planet. That is not the side that they're going to be looking at when drafting their idiotic regulations, like that you should get KYC of anybody that you make a $5 transfer to with Bitcoin, right?
And we're back. And welcome
Again.
back. Indeed.
So how's tricks?
Well, I've been getting quite excited about Christmas. I don't know why. I think it's because I have kids now. Somehow, like I'm excited because like they have no idea how incredible this specific day is going to be for them.
But they also
Typically, I've not been enthusiastic.
imagine that they're very young, so they also have zero expectations for Christmas and no idea what Christmas is, right? Like you could plant up a tree in July and they would go fucking nuts.
Yeah, well, but this is kind of the reason, like that. There's no way for me to explain to them that there's this specific day when they're going to get a crap ton of new toys and all their like favorite people are going to be there and stuff. So it's kind of fun to look forward to that. Usually I haven't been very enthusiastic, but that's been fun. I was also on a vacation where we recorded the previous podcast. And that got kind of messed up because one weekend we got the memo from I think it's called the Financial Supervisory Authority officially in Finland, that we'd gotten a green light for EUROe, which is the first EU regulated euro stablecoin. And so not an algo stablecoin, a regular USDC style stablecoin. And so that made me not vacation mentally as much as I might have hoped, but it's pretty exciting all the same.
I gotta say that's kind of disappointing, man. I mean, if you had gone for an algo stablecoin, this would allow me to give you so much shit and use so much stuff from the past episodes. It's kind of disappointed that you're gonna do this thing with an actual backed stablecoin. That's so fucking boring.
No, I mean, I could have gone for protocol owned liquidity and like all that stuff.
See?
I know there's so many avenues of approach. On stable coins, by the way, I do wonder at what point we're going to start getting abstractions on stable coins. Like right now, so abstractions in the sense that it doesn't really make sense that there's a whole bunch of different USD stable coins that are basically one-to-one equivalent in terms of how they trade typically, but then not in terms of how much trust is put in the underlying collateral. But if you trust Circle, you don't necessarily want to trust Tether as well. They're not the same.
Well, there are also different implementations, right? It's not like talking about, I don't know, USDC versus Paxos, right?
Well, I mean, be it Paxos or whatever, it doesn't matter. But my point is mainly that, like, surely at some point, there will be these stablecoin issuers, which will be, they've just been around for so long. Everyone trusts that they are working, like they have all the money that they say they have, etc. And so there's really no reason to treat them as like individual coins and have markets for trading between them. Like you might as well abstract that away somehow. And I've been thinking about that a lot. And it's probably not time yet because there's still so many questions, even long-term regulatory questions on how they're going to be treated. And even if you're very reliable and trustworthy and very conservative in the way you invest the underlying fiat, or don't at all now that interest rates are up. Um, like, who knows what's going to happen when CBDCs start coming out? Although I'm skeptical, shall we say, of any near-term developments. There's
I
a
think
lot
we've
of
gone
there's a
on
lot of
at length
news.
about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of news quite frequently about how they're being tested out in different places, right? Um, and every time I see one of those pieces of news, I remember when everyone was super hyped about UBI and they were doing tests and experiments in like little villages across Europe.
Different things, right? They're very different
Yes.
things. One of them would be geared towards social good and benefiting people. The other one is an instrument of control. We tend to favor instruments of control.
That's true. But there's some, and the reason it sort of never reached any sort of scale is probably because of that, right? Like there's not much of an incentive for governments to try to figure out how to give more money to people. Um, but in terms of the process by which these things happen, and like it generally does not happen quickly. And when you're talking about something that will impact every corner of the entire current financial industry, I suspect there almost is like no amount of testing that will suffice um, for them to sort of risk doing it. Maybe some slow transition will be possible, but I'm very skeptical of those implementations gaining ground very quickly. Though I do think I do think it would make sense for the European central banks and other central banks to kind of digitalize properly. I would be very curious to see what their current IT
Yeah, we'll see.
infrastructure.
This is one of those things where we could chase our own tails for the next couple hours, but we'll see.
Yeah. Um. So, what do you want to talk about?
I don't know. Do we want to talk or do we want to complain? Because we could pick different topics depending on what we want to do. Like this tweet from Honkasala that so perfectly encapsulates how I freaking feel about the industry right now. That every time that I see the news is like, oh God, again, there's stuff out there. Who fucked something up this time? It's honestly, it's been getting embarrassing, man. And I guess I'm gonna run. There was this complaint of yours. I think it was on the last time that we spoke, or maybe the time before that, about how much of a shit show the reporting from they like to say like the general not crypto specialized media has been about it around the FTX, and how they should let the crypto native voices come up and actually like lead the conversation. And then what? We realized that the block CEO was secretly funded by a $27 million loan for Alameda and FTX. Right? Like these are the crypto native voices that we're gonna start promoting. What the fuck, man?
Well, when I said we need some thoughtful, like the mainstream media needs to let the thoughtful crypto voices be heard, I did not mean the block specifically. um, but I will
Sure,
say
I
that that doesn't surprise me at all. But also, I don't think reflects especially badly on people who have been reporting for the block. Generally, they've been doing a reasonable job, I think.
I agree, but this makes it even easier to just paint the whole industry with the same "these people are clowns" brush, right? Like, for instance, I think Ryan Selkis from Mesari is a very is a very measured, very reasonable individual when it comes to talking about crypto. Yeah, he if you look at the
Is
rest
he?
of the I think so. Particularly if you look at him compared with the rest of the clowns and the cultists that we have out there, he he doesn't just take a single side. He looks at things in a balanced way. Like, and when he says something and he's wrong, he says like, "Oh yeah, I fucked that one up." Right? You don't get a lot of that in crypto.
That's true. That's true. And I respect Ryan a lot. Um, it was what was making me laugh was this describing him as a balanced individual, which makes me think you probably haven't been reading his recent tweets where he's just been like bouncing around all over the place, talking about waging some kind of war on somebody, the establishment, the SEC. I don't know.
Oh, okay, okay. Let me then qualify my balance thing because I think that in his position I would be doing the same thing. I like that he's waging war on politics by and large, so that's pretty cool. I mean, balance from a crypto standpoint. This is not
Yeah.
someone who's going to go like, "Oh, Ethereum is the future," or "Oh, Bitcoin is great and everything else is shit." even when even when you see a study that was commissioned, like they literally directly state this was commissioned by Project X, and they're talking about Project X, they actually look at the potential negatives as well. They think so. From a crypto standpoint, this is someone who definitely thinks that crypto's the future. He has zero doubts about it, but he is not going to present a one-sided view of crypto. And when there are bad actors in crypto, he is going to call them out. So that's what I mean by balance. And yeah, of course, he hates the fucking government because they're all clowns over there. So like, if I were living in the US and I saw an audience where all these politicians are bringing in people like Kevin O'Leary to just say like, "Oh no, it wasn't poor SBF who did it. It was the bad foreigner who actually caused all this mess." Like, I'd be pissed off too, frankly, particularly knowing that it's my taxes who are funding.
Yeah. And by the way, for those who don't know, Masari is Ryan's Ryan's company that does a bunch of like research and analysis and transparency stuff, I guess. But they put out a report every year. It's like 100 pages or something, but it's one of the best kind of yearly summaries of what's going on in crypto written in a way that isn't completely unintelligible to people who aren't in crypto, even though some parts of it no doubt would be. Um, but it's worth checking out. I think we're due soon.
And that's actually not just Masari. That's pretty much mostly Ryan doing the writing.
Yeah. 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 Um, I mean, yeah, it's problematic. In my notes, I just have it literally just says we look like a bunch of wankers, and that's the whole note as a
Dude,
as a topic for this podcast.
man, I, I really wish that wasn't the case, but every time that something like this happens, it is so easy for somebody who has even like not even let's say somebody who has an agenda against cryptos, just someone who is a casual naysayer. It's just so easy to point out that any of these things and go like, look, complete idiots. I told you.
Yeah, but that's not just because of these SPF things and whatever 3 hours capital, Celsius, etc. It's also just a regular dynamic of a bear market. Mm, Whenever the prices come down, everyone who didn't believe or lost a lot of money can then be like, look, it was a scam all along. Um,
Yeah, a
so
lot of congressional audiences in the last bear market. This shit is scaling up, man.
oh, I know. Um, and it's gonna scale up more and it's gonna get worse in that respect, unfortunately. Um, and then part of the reason is that it's going to take so long for regulators to like catch up enough. But on a more positive note, um, I I think I need to put together like a slide deck or something. But if we take a broader view of sort of blockchains over time, and this is something I've been thinking about, I think the trend lines for kind of some important metrics in terms of use cases and just usage users are going in a very promising direction. So if we look at, for example, cost, look at speed, which those are pretty much the most important ones as far as I'm concerned. Um, I think we can paint a pretty clear picture. Like today, with a handful of different blockchain environments, you can make transactions that are faster and cheaper than basically anything in the traditional world, right? That it's no longer like, oh, it's a bit faster because it's direct because we're going between
Yeah.
two banks. It's like it's faster than your like if you make a transfer within your bank, this is faster and cheaper. Like that I think is impressive. And if you look sort of over time, I need to actually get all the data and put this out, and costs, for example, is kind of hard to chart because cost when Bitcoin was worth zero was zero, right? Um, but you can do maybe some activity weighting and stuff like that to make it sort of make sense. Um, but you have these trend lines and they're coming down. And I don't think it looks like they're gonna stop. Um, so you have this like continuous lowering of cost, which I think over this sort of 10-ish year period is becoming quite evident, right? Um, from a crypto decentralization perspective, you can argue that like compromises, like it's all a result of compromises, but that's not true. Um, there are compromises that have been made, um, but but even within sort of decentralized networks, not talking about permissioned ones, you have significant cost cutting that's happened. Simultaneously, you have vast increases in speed that are probably going to keep getting a lot faster. And so, if you draw these kind of on a trend line, I think the trend line, and I need to actually go and draw this, but I think the trend line would be quite interesting if you were able to sort of map it pretty accurately, because you could start looking at, you could sort of extrapolate a little bit, sort of future speed, future cost, sort of. You could at least make some sort of informed prediction about those. And so my point with all of this is that I think today already, if we just ignore, decentralized compute and like whatever world computer bullshit, um, I think blockchain networks are already the fastest and cheapest payment system on the planet. Um, maybe there's something in real world use that's faster and cheaper, but I don't know about it. I'll do some research and we'll put out like a report or something. But I think this is quite important because it's sort of the baseline utility, I guess I would call it. It's like if everything else is complete bullshit, all just pump and dump, scam, blah de blah. Um, what we're left with is still the fastest and cheapest payment system on the planet. Um, and then to take it a step further from there, that's talking about just transfers. But given a transaction can be compute, you have um, sort of another. There's a very significant design space of use cases that are unlocked at some point on this trend line if we get low enough. So at some point, like, and this may never happen, but it's just an example to illustrate my point. At some point, um, you could like hypothetically have like a transaction be so cheap and so fast, it's the equivalent of a database entry in a centralized database. And obviously that is unlikely to be true, but in real world circumstances, it is possible that it gets close enough where you might as well because of the other benefits it gives you, like a shared platform, whatever. And so uh, thinking about it in this way, like very high level view, I think is quite important in moments when there is extreme, you know, skepticism and extreme anger and all this stuff about all the scams and ploys and general just opportunistic behavior that happens, because there is real stuff being built, right? And for some reason, because this whole payment system thing was like basically Bitcoin's pitch, it's not really discussed very much because it's quite boring to crypto people. And some and what that leads to is that like the world doesn't really know that that's the case, which is kind of interesting. But I don't know. What do you think?
Okay, I think that's a little bit rosy colored, but let me pick it apart.
It's it's specifically the rosy colored view to balance out the extremely negative view. But go ahead.
I hear you. Now, couple things there. First, it's not just that, yeah, there's scams, and yes, there's all this nonsense that keeps going on, and there's bullshit like the block founder, etc. Um, my issue is not that these things are happening, because those things have been happening for, well, pretty much ever since we had crypto, right? The issues that these things keep happening on an ever increasing scale that gives legislators who just want to fuck with it uh, a leg to stand on when they want to say this thing should be surveilled and stopped, right? So yes, this may be right now the cheapest cheapest, most efficient, freest payment network on the planet. That is not the side that they're going to be looking at when drafting their idiotic regulations, like that you should get KYC of anybody that you make a $5 transfer to with Bitcoin, right? So that is one issue there, right? The fact that this thing is good has never stopped the politician from getting in the way of their own advancement. Um, thing two, which we need to figure out is if this is actually sustainable, because in a lot of cases, this is cheap because it is being subsidized with issuance of more magical internet beans, which people still consider have a certain value or a certain potential future value, right? So they're happy to hold them so that they can dump them on whomever comes on next bull run. If either price cost,
That is a valid point, by the way. I want to just highlight that. Um, it is still all subsidized, with Ethereum being right now, at least on the average day, the least subsidized network. But Solana's not hugely subsidized either, as far as I know. Last I checked, it was like 7% inflation, which is
it is not hugely subsidized, but the fact is that it is. I mean, end of the day, you need to figure out who's going to end up buying these things, right? You're printing them, you're giving them to a validator. The validator has real world energy and server costs to pay because Solana choose hardware. So you're going to need to cover this cost, which means you need to sell this to somebody else. And that somebody else is not going to be another validator, right? It needs to be somebody who's using the network. And
so
even,
Solana's proof of stake is kind of like a proof of work, because it's while the while the costs for running the hardware sort of in a single moment are not that high, you get ever increasing costs because the hardware always breaks very quick.
I'm not sure if it's an ever increasing cost in the sense that Bitcoin mining difficulty does continually increase. Solana's hardware requirements do not, as far as I know, do not continue to increase. But you will have a certain constant expenditure of hardware, from what I understand. Or you should assume that you're going to have a certain constant expenditure of hardware. Where it's not going to be the Raspberry Pi that is going to keep running on a double weight battery for the next 6 years or something. So there is that, and the thing is, you're going to need to sell this to somebody else. Now, then the question is, what does this somebody else want to use it for? Uh, Arguably, they may want to use it just to transfer stuff on the network, but since Solana is so absurdly cheap to use, then there's not going
Yeah.
to be a lot of soul being spent on that. So I do think that we need to figure out either a way that the economic activity happening scales significantly, which could be where Saga and the sort of mass market efforts end up leading, or you just get economic activity of higher value, say whatever equivalent of crypto high frequency trading ends up moving to Solana. This has an increase on MEV because there's higher value transactions, and that's the way that this ends up generating money, right? But basically, I see a lot of these networks are still on the maybe seed Series A stage of a startup, where a lot of the business is subsidized. Is not some of them like Ethereum might be at a Series C, like you're just like scaling like crazy, but they're still kind of subsidized on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a big advocate for the idea that like you should make your you should make the network as fast and as cheap for the end user as possible. I There's a lot of argumentation in the Ethereum world for kind of almost like artificial block space scarcity in order to make block space more valuable and thus make the network more valuable. I think that's sort of complete bullshit. Like Like
Sort
okay,
of.
maybe we don't like spend as much on Solana transaction fees, but the likelihood that a lot of people will do that goes up significantly.
Yeah.
Um, so there's that. And I want to quickly give you another idea, sort of relating to this, and kind of relating to the hardware stuff. And by the way, I want to warn anyone who's listening; these are not that well thought out, as most things we say here are not. Because
In case you haven't listened to us before.
indeed, indeed, because we do not prep, and we don't plan to start. Um, so I had this. So for a long time, I've kind of had this idea that like centralization is always going to dominate speed and cost. Um, and while that is certainly true, kind of in a sort of first principles, everything built from scratch, blah blah blah, sort of state. Um, I, I started thinking about kind of what we're competing with in reality. So let's take the payments analogy again. Um, like if all payments happened in one supercomputer, then that would probably be cheaper and faster than any blockchain could provide. However, how likely is that to ever happen? And certainly that is not the current state, right? And then
And
let's take Solana as an example because it's the most likely candidate for being a network run by supercomputers at some point in time. Um, like, is it like so let's say Solana is run by 100 supercomputers. Um, and it's competing not with this current state of the financial market, but this sort of one supercomputer um, that is controlled by someone, of course. Um, so th- there is definitely going to be a difference in speed and cost, but is that difference going to be material enough to justify handing over the one supercomputer that the financial system runs on to one guy?
yeah,
Or, um, And so there's like a social cost to centralization. And the question sort of becomes, is the social cost um, larger or smaller than the sort of extra redundancy? And by the way, one single supercomputer is going to have a crazy amount of redundancy as well. Um, so
Yeah,
what
which
is the
is
actual
what
trade-off?
wanted to point out. I mean, so let's take this as a thought exercise, right? Let's say that the single supercomputer that runs all payments in the world, right? One box. I would agree that chances are, if this is optimized enough, I would agree that chances are that recording the recording and validating that transaction on that single supercomputer is going to be faster. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's going to be cheaper, because when you take into account cost, like we were saying, that you can't just take the cost of recording, of paying for the transfer on Solana, you need to see the cost of running the server. Um, if you were to actually get this hypothetical supercomputer running everything, I can imagine that the security costs for that thing are going to be fucking insane, because that is going to be the mother of all honeypots. And if that thing gets attacked, then the cost of that particular attack is probably something that we have never seen ever, period, in the world, period.
Can you
So
imagine if there was a place, like one thing you could hack to get trillions?
yeah, I mean, it's people are gonna go there. Period. It's like you're gonna get the best and brightest minds in online fuckery attacking that thing. So it's I would say that yeah, the speed is definitely better. Cost, I'm not sure is the case.
So so I was kind of I fully agree, and I was kind of bundling that into social cost. Like there's a whole segment of cost relating to coordinating everything related to that one supercomputer. But what I find interesting in this thought experiment, because uh, like I just go through these loops of like, how is this all going to work, and how is decentralization going to compete with centralization? Um, and So in that hypothetical world, right? It's not. It feels to me like it would actually be somewhat balanced, right? You have a network of supercomputers, and then you have one mega supercomputer, and it's trade-offs. But it's not like, when we're talking about supercomputers, we're talking about and maybe we're not talking about, billions of validators. We're talking about some set that's enough, that is geographically distributed enough, whatever. Um the differences start to be so minimal that it's like, and if there's a significant difference in, like, for example, who is in control when these systems are being used, I think it becomes much more blurry. But then when we step back from that thought experiment and look at the world today, um, decentralization is not competing with one mega supercomputer. Not at all. We're competing with like a billion tiny, shittily optimized servers running in like all kinds of different places. Not at all like, half of them don't have load balancing. They go down all the time. Like, like that's the reality of it. Yeah. There's a million different software stacks. There's, it's a mess. And even if you want to say like, okay, but AWS is kind of like a mega supercomputer. Not really, because there's individual implementations on there that are
Yeah.
either running on dedicated hardware, which is again the separate server thing running somewhere, or virtualized hardware. And so they're not configured to all act in unison to do a single purpose. Um, and that, I think, paints a very cheery picture for decentralization, because if we did manage to get this, like, we're not that far from having networks that are run by supercomputers, essentially. I mean, arguably, some of them already are this with, for some definition of supercomputer. Um, and those like that's like a true democratization of kind of the compute in the world in the sense that you get access to the full capability. It's not like no one else gets Amazon's supercomputer because it's not for them because it's not generic. It's designed for one purpose only, but in these they're designed for one purpose only, and that's to execute programs in their virtual machine. And I think that's quite exciting, and I haven't quite figured out how to ex- explain. Like, it's not a new idea. It's just it's more of a sort of slight twist on the general centralization versus decentralization issue. Because for the longest time, I've been concerned that when it all comes down to it, people don't care that much about decentralization, and centralization is going to be cheaper and faster. And if that is not actually the case at some end state, I think that changes the game considerably.
I just think that we look at this a little bit different because it seems that you're comparing these two things in basically in terms of network properties up to a point, and saying that we this is not a centralized system competing against a decentralized against a decentralized system. These are two decentralized systems competing against each other, or really, it's decentralized system competing against a fragmented system. At the point is that your point
Well,
here?
yeah, so we have to. So I guess what you're getting at is that there's also not a single coherent decentralized network, so we can't compare it with like,
Not
and that's fair.
not even that. Yeah, I think that I to me it's not just an issue of okay. This is one way to put it. I think that you're looking at this in terms of network topology, whereas I looked at centralized versus decentralized in terms of social topology. So on organizational topology, it is not an issue of is Ethereum or Solana as are they as dissimilar internally as the sort of networks? It's an issue of if a centralized organization wants to make a decision, it can move much faster and much more decisively than this other things that need to agree on. And given that these other things don't get to coordinate nearly as well, you are also going to get the propagation of basically the risk cascade that we have been seeing. Just because you composed with something that you didn't really fully understand, that whole thing brings everything down. So that's more how I would see the differences on what is likely to succeed. Are they services that the organizationally centralized things can provide better and faster than the decentralized networks? And do people mostly care about that edge? Not necessarily is this transfer going to be 5 cents versus 7 cents?
I I see what you mean. I think there's a distinction between application level and infrastructure level. Um, on the infrastructure level, I'm not sure like that I'm talking about that like and whether in an end state the infrastructures how they will be competitive relative to each other. Um, and there is an argument to be made that like iteration speed is faster on the centralized side. Um, but is that true on the infrastructure level? I'm not sure. Like, people are
The thing
spinning
is,
up new networks faster than they're spinning up startups, man.
sure, but I don't really care about that. Mostly because this could perfectly be the inverse of the there's this whole joke about Web3 mullet that is decentralized on the front and centralized on the back. And I'm sure if you remember one of the arguments that I made when we had the Stack Zero sessions in Berlin, which if I pointed out that if you could argue that if Libra, for instance, which Libra was still a thing back then, if Libra were fully built on top of Bitcoin, for instance, if Bitcoin were like the rails for Libra, for whatever thought exercise again.
How
Right.
how is that a thought exercise? That's like saying, if you used an Apple as a car.
No, I mean you could use Bitcoin or Ethereum or anything else as the Libra transfer network, right? The Libra value transfer network. It's not the thing.
For Libra as a currency.
No, why not? You could implement it on top of Ethereum.
But
What's
okay,
stopping
okay.
you?
So my understanding of Libra is as a network, and so then it
No, no, forget it. Think
yeah.
of Libra as what the users end up. What the promise was back then.
So
That
a basket of goods currency.
the basket of currencies that users end up interacting with when they go to WhatsApp or Instagram or whatever, right? So forget all the other technical stuff. They decide like all our engineers are idiots, or we're not going to build this thing because it's too much trouble. We're going to build on an existing network, right? If Libra as a currency had been built on top of Ethereum, that is still not a win for permissionlessness, even if it's running on what is in theory a permissionless network, because a centralized organization still controls the smart contract and the user interface and the contact point for absolutely everyone. It's still a centralized company. So to me, it's not about are these centralized institutions end up going defaulting to building their stuff on the open networks, which they might. But as long as they control whatever happens with the interaction on the system that is built on these networks, this is still not a plus for freedom.
Nah, I don't care about that at all. And I'll explain why. So first of all, like my premise is always like if we want to get all this stuff on chain, like there's going to be centralized entities in control because there's some centralized entity that has an army and decides who owns land and shit, right? Like there's no way we're going to encode that into a smart contract in a way where it would be defensible, in the physical world. Um, unless blockchains had their own armies, which would be interesting. Um, anyway, so that this is gonna happen. I mean, stable coins, etc. You can have algorithmic versions of them. You can also have sort of fiat-backed versions of them, and then the consumers decide, right? My point is that the permissionlessness isn't in the currency itself. It's in the platform, right? You have access to the platform. You can create your own currency, etc., and then consumers will decide. And obviously, regulators will fuck with everyone's ability to compete and whatever. But I don't know. I maybe this is just bear market me talking. I've like gone right back to technology. Don't really care about anything else.
You're in it for the tech again.
Well, I'm always in it for the tech, but then I get distracted when there's crazy shit going on. But like, a bear market it's a good time to reflect. On-
Yes, there are lots of meditations going on.
Yeah. Um, and for me, it's like every cycle. I mean, naturally, in the crash, the question is, for me at least, having been around for so long already, is like, do we have something real yet? Because for the longest time, we did not. Like every time there was a bull market, I'd be like, whoa, 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 like there is nothing here yet. And so the part about the payment system is something that gives me a lot of comfort because there is something real here. It's something that was, envisioned in 2008, but realistically, it wasn't like viable for large scale use until a few years ago, 2 years ago, if that.
No, a
Like
bit longer. I mean, you've been hearing
it depends on what you're
stories.
comparing to, right? But for me, Ethereum already was like viable for use in global payments and whatever. But I think like now it's undeniable. Like it's what, like a 0.00035 transaction fee on Solana, almost instant. Um, Basically the same thing on Polygon. Like, there's a lot of places where you can do things very quickly now and very cheaply.
Yes, the part that I would agree is that at this point, it is undeniable that this is a convenient, fast, efficient, cheap payment system, even in places where you have alternatives, right? Because
Yeah.
the thing is, before they had already proven themselves in scenarios where again
Yeah.
you're
If you
the
if you live
Nigerian
in the jungle.
craftsman, the Nigerian craftsman ordering stuff from Shenzhen, right? That's already a scenario in which it had proven itself. But you could argue like, hey, I live in the EU. I don't care about that, right? I can order the
I live
stuff
in
from Alibaba.
Finland, not just the
Yeah.
EU, Finland. We've had like near instant bank payments before anyone in the world had them. So
No.
I'm interested primarily in myself and how fast my payments are.
So yeah, I would agree that at this point it had reached that point, where we have networks like Solana, which have reached that point for mass users.
Yeah.
They're
And
still not there on the privacy side, but
no, and that is actually it. That's a good topic to maybe finish on. Um because privacy has to be figured out. Like absolutely has to be figured out. I don't think any of this shit will work very well unless we get it. Um but it does come with some very tricky problems. Not like technical problems per se, but the problem is, how do we get privacy without all the criminals that would usually come with it?
we already have the criminals. It's
Yeah, so I'm not saying there won't be criminals. Like, looking at the traditional system is doing a fairly poor job of preventing criminals from doing stuff, right? No, nothing, no issues there. Um, but we do need, like, even just to get sort of private systems accepted, I think we'll need to have some sort of mechanisms for preventing illicit use. It's too easy to point at them otherwise and be like, "That's the problem."
If we get there, if we get to the point where the thing that they object to is like, oh, now you can do zero knowledge proofs cheaply on Solana, so we should stop this. Like, God, then things have progressed much further than that I would have thought. My pessimistic view is that they're gonna try eventually one of this stupid, idiotic things like what Elizabeth Warren is pushing now are going to end up get accepted, and this is going to have a massive chilling effect before we even get to properly private options. Never
No,
mind
we're
what
gonna
this would
we're
do to
gonna
something
get
like
we're gonna
fintech.
get private options. Shout out
I
to
know that.
Aztec Network that just raised 100 million from A16Z.
No, it's not a technical issue. What I'm saying is that my concern is that they are going to be fucking with crypto before this is even end user practical.
Yeah, but they don't even know about the privacy stuff that's coming yet. They're still thinking about how to deal with like Bitcoin and Ethereum
Yeah,
and
and that's enough.
OneCoin.
The fact is that them fucking with these things at a completely stupid level, like, oh no, you need KYC for every freaking address that you interact with. That by itself is going to have a pretty strong impact of murdering usage on these things, if it were to pass. So to me, if we actually get to the point where like, oh, the fact that there's a cogent discussion around zero knowledge proofs in the Senate and whatnot, that would be almost a dream.
Yeah, but I think there are ways of avoiding getting caught in like the privacy specific crosshair. So there's the blockchain crosshair, which is one thing. Um, and then there's sort of the privacy specific crosshair, which is like basically in some circumstances, like the argument that is made by, for example, law enforcement is that in some circumstances we need to be able to figure out what has happened. And it's a very slippery slope, but I'm inclined to agree that there are circumstances like that.
It's not an issue of a slippery slope. There's no, at the very least, I am wholly unaware of any technical solution where you can say selective disclosure, and that
Oh, it's
selective
possible.
disclosure is not at the whims of whomever has access to the key.
Of course, it's at the whims. Well,
Well, there's no
let
privacy.
me paint a picture. You can so first of all, the general way to do this right is viewing keys. So um you can generate viewing keys which allow you to see some transactions, transaction paths, or all transactions, or whatever. Like you can build the network to have this capability, not that you could just go and generate Zcash viewing keys for anyone else but yourself. Um, but the like so you have these viewing keys that those are like the answer, and typically what networks have done is that you can generate viewing keys and give them to other people. And so you can generate a viewing key for the government and be like, okay, here's the transaction path, I didn't do anything wrong, blah blah blah. We could have networks of nodes. So how some people are doing it is they have like a group of watchers who can collectively decide to expose a specific transaction path, for example, if it's like being investigated by law enforcement. And you don't need to make that individual specific. You can use threshold cryptography or probably MPC, things like that, to make it be sort of a collective decision across some group. Um, Granted, that group is very explicit and doesn't change very easily, and that's problematic. But there are ways of changing for example, in threshold cryptography, there are ways of adding and removing people from the set. I don't know. That could work, man. That could work.
Yeah, that I still don't think
Just
that.
just make it hard enough. Like it changes the privacy guarantee for you, but if it's hard enough, if it's like you can see, if it's like 50 people need to agree to expose specifically your transactions, then like you would probably still use it
I
unless you were doing something criminal.
The thing is, to me, this is basically, first of all, there's two issues with this. Uh, the thing is that this is, to me, no different for intents and purposes of DCP double speak of controlled anonymity. It's exactly the same thing. The second is that if this is that difficult to get disclosure on, I would assure you that governments still are not going to be comfortable with it, because the only thing that they're going to be comfortable with is if there's enough people that they can beat with a stick for this thing to be exposable. Because what they care is about access, right? It's not going to be 50 people in, I don't know, 30 different countries that need to agree or something. They need access, and this, if this is three people who are all in the same zip code, perfect. If this is 10 people with different nationalities, yeah, it still might as well just use zero knowledge proofs, because we're still not gonna like it.
Well, yeah, and maybe the answer and like so maybe the answer is that you just full privacy, and then governments and especially police forces will figure out ways of getting around that, like they figure out ways of getting around Signal and all these other things, right?
Yeah. And
That might be okay. Like there's bound to be pushback. It's like if yeah, there's pushback even for messaging. So of course there's going to be pushback for private money or private money movements. Um, so maybe that's the way to go. And personally, I I think I think about this stuff a lot, but I'm kind of like landing on like we need to figure out the technology first and make it cheap enough, and then we'll worry about the kind of how to make sure that all this doesn't happen. Because if we can't make it cheap enough, and so for context, privacy always comes with a lot of cost overhead
Yeah.
and some speed overhead as well. Actually, quite a lot of speed overhead. And so what you need to do is to make that again competitive with sort of current crypto payments. Um, and if we can do that, and for by the way, I think Solana is a promising place to do that, unless you do like your own network entirely. Um, then you can think about how to move or do all that. But it does require some. It does require some thought. Like there's a problem where if privacy is really expensive, then only criminals use it, and so you almost like need to make it cheap so that it becomes useful to everyone. Like if it was just like you turn it on or off, no
Mm.
other impact, then everyone would use it, of course.
I'm not sure, actually. I mean, VPNs are cheap. Barely anybody uses them. PGP encryption is free. Nobody uses it. So it's not just an issue of turning it on and off. It's an issue of the cognitive overhead associated with it, and people not even knowing that this thing is not private in the first place, right? Like a lot of
Fair.
people still think that Telegram is completely encrypted and safe.
Wow. That's true, but that's because Telegram literally like said that for a
Sure,
long time.
fine. But Telegram does have turn on and turn off again encryption. You can just start a private chat and people don't know it's there because they have to right click on something, right? So I
Well,
don't
I
think,
think Telegram has very intentionally kind of de-emphasized that. I'm not sure
yeah,
why
that's
exactly, but they have.
different rabbit hole.
That's I have one last thing to make it a lighter note to end on. Have you heard of this Twitter um, account called VC Starter Kit?
I have seen a few things out of there, but I don't follow it.
Oh, it's amazing. The description is if you assemble enough people wearing Patagonia vests, a venture fund spontaneously forms around them. Oh, it's so good. These
It, actually, I'll need to look it up. If I recall correctly, one of their examples for like the Patagonia vest starting kit guy was Samsung next president at some point.
Oh no. Okay. Well, thank you. And thank you for listening in if there is anyone listening in.
We very much appreciate all three of you, Mom.
Yeah. Yeah. And Merry Christmas, I guess. See you
Okay,
guys
man. Enjoy
next.
the new year.
All right.